Life's funny, isn't it? One minute you're on top of the world, the next, it's crumbling beneath your feet. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This story begins in the warm glow of happiness. My name's Emily, and not too long ago, my biggest problem was deciding what to cook for dinner or what movie to watch on a lazy Sunday afternoon. James and I met in what you might call the old-fashioned way, at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was the guy flipping burgers and telling stories, making everyone laugh. I remember thinking, who is this guy? With his easy smile and a way of looking at me like I was the only one there. It didn't take long for us to become an us. "Emily, you have to try my special burger," he'd said, handing me a plate with a confidence that made me smile. "It's got a secret sauce that'll change your life." I laughed, rolling my eyes. "Change my life, huh? That's a pretty big claim for a burger." But I'll admit, it was a darn good burger. Maybe not life-changing, but it definitely made that day memorable. Not long after, James met Grandma. She was everything to me, the one who raised me when my own parents couldn't. The way he talked to her, with respect and a bit of playful banter, it won her over in a heartbeat. "I like him," she whispered to me as he went to grab us some lemonade. "He's genuine, and he's got kind eyes. You hold on to this one, Emily." And hold on, I did. We got married in a small ceremony, just family and close friends. The house I moved into was full of memories. The walls echoed with laughter from a time when my parents were still alive. James and I started filling it with new memories of our own, and it felt like life was just right. I got pregnant about a year into the marriage. When I told James, the look on his face was something I thought I'd remember forever with warmth in my heart. His joy seemed to match mine, filling up the room until it was almost bursting. "We're going to have a baby, Em," he said, lifting me up and spinning me around. "A little one of our own, can you believe it?" "I can," I whispered back, "because it's happening with you." They say bad news never has good timing. The day I lost Grandma was a cold slap of reality, a reminder that life doesn't play fair. Grandma was more than family. She was my confidant, my cheerleader, my safe place. Losing her felt like being adrift at sea without a compass. I remember sitting on the sofa, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, numb. James came to me, his face a mask of concern. "Em, talk to me," he urged, his voice gentle. "What's there to talk about?" I muttered, staring at the tea, watching as it lost its steam, its warmth, its life, kind of like how I felt inside. "We'll get through this together. You're not alone," he said, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. But his words, meant to comfort, felt distant, like a radio playing softly in the background, familiar yet easy to tune out. Then, as if I hadn't already been robbed of enough, our baby slipped away before I ever got to hold them, to tell them how much I loved them, to promise them the world. The miscarriage was like a physical blow, one that knocked the wind out of me and left me gasping for air, for answers, for comfort that wouldn't come. James was there, yes, always there, but somehow not really. "Emily, we can try for another baby when you're ready," he said one night as we lay in the darkness, his voice void of the pain I felt. I turned to him, a part of me desperate to find the husband who had once spun me around in joy. "I don't want another baby, James. I wanted this one. Our baby." The words were a whisper, but they might as well have been screams for how they echoed in the silence. "We'll make it through this," he said. But his assurance sounded hollow, like a promise made out of obligation rather than desire. I sought refuge in solitude, in the quiet of the house filled with too many ghosts of what could have been. Days melded into nights, and I lost track of time. I lost track of myself. James tried, in his way. "Let's go out, see people. It might help," he suggested one day, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair I was slumped in. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on a crack in the wall, a blemish I hadn't noticed before. "I can't face the world, James. Not yet. The world is where the pain is." "Emily, staying cooped up in here won't change what happened," he pressed, but I barely heard him. How could I tell him that the world outside these walls reminded me of everything I had lost? That every street corner, every shop window, every smiling face was a reminder of a happiness that felt like it had been stolen from me? The funeral was a blur. People came, they said things, they left. I nodded, I shook hands, I accepted condolences. But nothing got through. I was in a bubble, watching life happen around me, a life I no longer felt a part of. James was there, of course, but his presence felt more like a shadow than a source of warmth. "You're so strong, Emily," he told me after the service, his hand finding mine. I wanted to pull away, to scream that I wasn't strong, that I was broken. Instead, I just nodded. What was the point in correcting him? The truth seemed too heavy to share, even with him. As days turned into weeks, I felt James pulling away. Maybe he was tired of dealing with someone who seemed to have given up on life. Maybe he just didn't know how to help me. Maybe he needed an escape from the suffocating sadness that had enveloped our home. "I'm here for you, Em, but you need to start being here too," he said one evening, his patience wearing thin. "Here?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where here is anymore, James." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I mean, you need to start living again, for your sake and mine." I looked up at him then, really looked at him, and saw the strain in his eyes. I knew he was struggling too, in his own way, but the gulf between us had grown too wide, too deep to cross with mere words. That's when the creeping thought began to take root. Maybe I was alone in this after all. James was there, but not really. Not in the way I needed him to be. As the days rolled into weeks and then months, the chasm between James and me grew wider. The man who had once seemed like my anchor was becoming more and more like a stranger, coming home late and sometimes not at all. It gnawed at me, this feeling of him slipping away. I remember one evening, the clock ticking past midnight and the other side of the bed still cold and untouched. When he finally came through the door, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Where have you been, James? Do you know what time it is?" My voice was shaky but firm. He looked tired, his eyes avoiding mine. "Work's been a nightmare. You know how it is." His voice was flat, dismissive almost. "No, I don't know," I snapped back. "Because you never talk to me about it anymore. You never talk to me about anything." He let out a long sigh and began to take off his jacket. "Em, we've been through this. Work is work. It's stressful, and I don't want to burden you with it." "But I want to share that burden, James. I thought that's what we did," I said, the last of my words trailing off into a whisper. He paused and finally sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at me. "I know, and I appreciate it, but you have enough on your plate." "Enough on my plate?" I repeated, incredulous. "You mean dealing with the loss and trying to piece myself back together? Do you think ignoring me helps with that?" "That's not what I'm doing," he protested. But even as he said it, it sounded like he didn't believe it himself. "I offered you a divorce, James," I reminded him, my voice breaking a little. "I told you that you didn't have to stay with me out of pity or obligation." He looked up sharply at that. "Is that what you think this is? Pity? Obligation?" There was a hint of the old fire in his voice, a glimmer of the man I knew. "Yes, that's what it feels like," I admitted. "You're here, but you're not with me, not really, and it hurts." He ran his hands through his hair, a sure sign he was stressed. "Em, I'm trying. I really am. But I can't just switch off from work. It's been really tough." "But it's more than work, isn't it? You're away even when you're here. You've got your phone on you all the time, always texting, always distracted." He didn't say anything to that, just stared at the floor. "Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and frightening. "Em, don't be ridiculous," he said quickly, but his eyes told a different story. I felt a coldness spread through me. This was not the man I married, the one who would look me in the eyes and tell me the truth, no matter how hard. "I need you to be honest with me, James. Please," I implored, my hands clasping and unclasping in my lap. He was silent for a long moment, and then, "There's no one else. It's just work. You've got to believe me." I wanted to. Oh, how I wanted to believe him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and once that happens, things can never go back to how they were. In the weeks that followed, I watched James like a detective. I noticed how his phone was always face down, how he'd step out of the room to take calls. The signs were there, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. It was a Wednesday when my world finally started to crumble. I answered a call from a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Is this Emily Stanton? The voice was male, gruff, and not one I knew. Yes, who's this? The man paused and then, we need to talk about your husband. My heart sank. What about him? I think you'd better sit down, Mrs. Stanton. The cafe was one of those nondescript places, sandwiched between a laundromat and a closed-down bookstore. It seemed like a fitting backdrop for what was to come. I sat there, stirring my coffee, each second stretching out like an eternity until the man showed up. He was a large man, with a look that didn't invite many questions. He sat across from me, his hands clasped together, a folder sitting like a barrier between us. Mrs. Stanton, I'm sorry for the mystery, but I thought it was best we talk in person, he started, his voice serious. Who are you? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside. He nodded as if he expected the question. My name's Mike Sanders, and I believe we have a common problem. Your husband, James. I swallowed hard. What about him? Mike opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. It was James with a woman I'd never seen before. They were laughing, close, too close. That's my wife, Mike said, tapping the picture. I felt a strange detachment looking at it. What do they have to do with each other? They work together, and they're having an affair, he said bluntly. I looked up, meeting his gaze. That's impossible. James would never... He reached back into the folder and took out a handful of printed messages, placing them in front of me. These are just from the past week. I read them, each word a tiny dagger. There were plans to meet up, pet names, and talk of the future. A future without me, without us. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice a ghost of itself. Because I thought you should know, and because I want to end it. I thought maybe you would want that too. I stared at the evidence, my mind racing, but my heart already knew the truth. He told me he loved me. He promised he'd never leave. People lie, Mrs. Stanton, and they're good at it, Mike said, his voice bitter. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. He was all I had. Mike leaned forward. You got a choice here. You can pretend this never happened, go on with your life. Or you can confront him, make him face what he's done. And what about you? I asked. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. I'm going to divorce her. She can have him if she wants. I just want out. My hands were shaking as I gathered the papers, folding them with care I didn't feel. What are you going to do? Mike asked. The answer surprised even me. I'm going to fight back. Mike nodded. Good. If you need anything, evidence, support, you let me know. Thank you, I said. But as I stood up, I felt anything but thankful. My life as I knew it was over, and it was time for me to figure out what came next. That day, the sun hung low, a glaring eye that seemed to watch over the unfolding scene with indifference. I was waiting on the porch when James's car pulled up. His step was light, too light for a man coming home to a crumbling marriage. He caught the look on my face as he approached. What's with the gloom? He asked casually, as if my scowl was just another part of an ordinary day. I held up one of the photos silently. His eyes flicked to it, and his smile faltered, but only for a second. Oh, that, he chuckled. I see you've met my other woman. I felt a hollow laugh bubble up from my throat. Is that all you can say? Oh, that? He folded his arms and leaned against the porch railing. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? Because it wasn't. I'm not sorry, and it was no mistake. Why, James? I demanded, my hands clenching the photo so tightly the edges crumpled. He laughed, a cold, heartless sound. You were convenient, you know? A nice house, a decent bit of savings, and when your grandmother passed, well, that was just icing on the cake. I recoiled as if he'd struck me. You think my grandmother's death was a financial gain? Why else would I stick around? He shrugged. Especially after, you know. He paused, eyeing me with a cruelty I hadn't seen before. After the kid. I shook my head in disbelief. And you hoped what? That I'd off myself in grief? Would have made things simpler, he quipped. His words were like acid, burning through the last vestiges of the life I thought I knew. You're vile, I hissed. You always were too sensitive, too stupid to see what was right in front of you. He continued mercilessly. You thought I would end my life? I asked, the reality of his betrayal sinking in, a cold weight in my stomach. It would have been a win-win. You'd escape your pathetic little life, and I'd be free with a nice little nest egg. His grin was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. I couldn't hold back the tears, but I was damned if I'd let him see them fall. And now? What's your grand plan now? Now? He laughed again, stepping closer. Now, I guess I'll have to settle for a divorce. You'll probably screw me over on that, won't you? Drag it out. Make me suffer. You don't deserve quick and easy, I managed to say, my voice surprisingly even. His expression soured. You're an ugly, stupid woman, you know that? I don't know what I was thinking, marrying you. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I felt something shift inside me. The man I had loved was a ghost, a fiction. In his place stood a stranger with a heart full of venom. Get off my porch, James, I said quietly. He smirked, taking a step back. Gladly. This place was never really my style anyway. The courthouse was a place where I thought I'd celebrate our milestones. Instead, I walked up its steps to dissolve the very foundation of my marriage. Mike was right beside me, his presence a silent support. I had the papers in my hand, feeling the weight of every word that testified against James. Mike carried his own set of damning evidence, a mirror to my betrayal. Our steps echoed in the empty hallway, a march towards a verdict we both needed. Inside the courtroom, the air was stale, heavy with the burden of judgments past. James and his mistress, Mike's wife, were already there, a tableau of guilt. Mrs. Stanton? The clerk called out. I stepped forward, handing over the sheaf of papers that detailed every misstep of my husband's affair. The judge surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on me, then on Mike. You have evidence to present? I nodded, my throat tight. Yes, Your Honor. The evidence was laid bare for the court to see. Photographs that spoke 1,000 words of betrayal, texts and call logs that wove a narrative of deceit. I didn't look at James. I didn't need to see his face to remember his lies. And how do you plead? The judge asked, turning to James and his co-defendant. Their answers were a soft murmur of legalese. No contest. The judge took his time, reviewing the evidence, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice the gavel that shattered the last tie between James and me. In light of the uncontested evidence, I am granting the petition for divorce. The division of assets will proceed as outlined, and given the circumstances, Mr. Stanton, you will also pay restitution. James stood, his face ashen, but I felt nothing. No victory, no joy, just the hollow end of a chapter. Mike met my gaze, a silent question in his eyes. Had it been worth it? I could only nod. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about setting the record straight, about reclaiming my dignity from the ruins James had left behind. The courtroom's heavy door swung closed behind me with a sound that felt final. Mike and I found a quiet corner in the bustling hallway outside. So, it's done, Mike said, his voice a mix of relief and something else, maybe sadness. I nodded, the reality of the situation settling in. It's done. They didn't even put up a fight, did they? No, he sighed, looking down at the floor. They knew there was no point. I thought about James, about the love I thought we shared, and how it had all been a lie. Do you think they're sorry for what they did, or just sorry they got caught? Mike's gaze met mine, steady and sure. Does it matter? They're out of our lives now. That's what counts. I let out a long breath, one I'd been holding since the day I got that call. I guess you're right. I didn't want it to end this way. Nobody ever does, he said. But you stood up for yourself. That counts for a lot. The weight of the papers in my bag seemed lighter now. Justice, or something like it, had been served. It didn't undo the past, but it cleared the path for the future. I just want to move on, I admitted. And you will, Mike assured me. This is a fresh start for both of us. I managed a small smile. A fresh start, I echoed. We walked to the exit, the light from the doors growing brighter as we approached. Outside, the sun was shining, and the world moved on, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding in its midst. Emily, Mike said as we stepped into the daylight, what will you do first? I thought for a moment. I'm going to go home, take a long bath, and then I'm going to start planning my future, one step at a time. That sounds perfect, he said. And if you ever need a friend, you know where to find me. I looked at him, grateful for his unexpected friendship. Thank you, Mike, for everything. The days following the divorce were quiet. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some of Grandma's old things, the doorbell rang. I hesitated for a moment, half expecting the past to be on my doorstep, but it was just Sarah, my neighbor. Hey, Emily, she greeted me with a warm, if somewhat pitying smile. I heard about everything. I'm so sorry. I brought you some casserole. I figured you might not feel like cooking. I managed a small laugh. You figured right. Thanks, Sarah. We settled in the kitchen, the casserole warming in the oven, filling the room with a homely scent. So, what will you do now? Sarah asked, sipping on the tea I'd made for us. I'm not sure, I admitted, but I'm thinking of selling the house. There are too many memories here. I need a fresh start. That sounds like a good idea, she said. A new place, new memories. Yeah, I mused, gazing out of the kitchen window. I want to travel too, see the places Grandma and I always talked about. That's wonderful, Emily. It's what you deserve, Sarah encouraged. I smiled, feeling a flicker of excitement at the thought. It is, isn't it? I spent so long living for someone else, trying to be what James wanted. It's time I lived for myself. Sarah reached across the table, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. You've got this. And who knows, maybe along the way, you'll find someone who loves you for you. I hope so. But for now, I'm okay with being by myself, I said, feeling a strength within me that I hadn't felt in years. You're stronger than you know, Emily. And this fresh start is just the beginning for you, Sarah said with a knowing nod. The timer on the oven dinged then, breaking our conversation. As I stood to get the casserole out, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter with James was over, but my story was far from finished. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought of Grandma, of her strength and her love. She had wanted me to be happy, to be cared for. In the end, I realized the person who needed to care for me the most was myself. And with that realization, I knew that no matter where I went or what I did, I would be okay.